In this short video, we'll learn about the general workflow and working with Arnold for Cinema 4D. Just setting Arnold as your render engine, adding a light source, adding a camera, assigning basic materials to objects, previewing your render interactively using IPR, and a final render. This lesson is designed for people who are just starting with rendering and really don't have the slightest idea what the process is like. If you have ever done any sort of rendering, you can safely skip this video. I have already created a few objects in my scene. I have a floor plane and a simple sphere on top of it. The first thing you need to do is to define Arnold as your render engine, which we'll learn in the previous lesson. In the render settings, change your render to Arnold render. Now let's create a light source. Simply go to the extensions menu, C4D2A, Arnold light, and add a quad light, which gives you a rectangular area light. Now let's position the light, and a very simple way to do that is to use the look at option in the Arnold light. As the sphere is our main subject, let's tell the light to look at the sphere all the time. Now we can move around the light and it will always shine at the sphere. Now we can start to interactively preview our render using IPR. In order to do that, you need to go to the extensions menu again, C4D2A, and choose IPR window. Now we can see an almost real-time render of our scene. I'm going to set the IPR scale to around 70% of the final resolution so we can see a bigger render. Let's find a nice view and create a perspective camera from the Arnold menu. The light is too dark, so let's increase its brightness by a few steps until we get a better exposure. We can see this noise around the shadow edges, so let's increase the quality of our light by increasing its sample from 1 to 4. Now that's smooth. We can create two different materials or shaders for our floor plane and our sphere in the next step. So in the Material Manager window, click on Create, then Arnold, then Surface, and finally click on the Standard Surface Shader. Now we have a new shader in our scene. Let's assign it to our sphere. Double click on it so we have our material editor opened. Change the color to this turquoise color. Increase the weight to 1 and decrease the specular roughness to 0.05 to get a shinier specular reflection. And that's our first Arnold material. Yay! Now let's create a new standard surface shader for the floor plane and assign it to the floor, obviously. Rename it to something like ground or plane or whatever, or floor. This time, instead of using a color to define the base or diffuse portion of our shader, we specify a texture as our base color. In order to do that, you need to go inside Arnold Shader Network Editor, double click on the material to open up Material Editor, click on this Open Network Editor button. For now, let's just learn how to use a texture as our base color, okay? We don't want to get confused, do we? We're just starting. It's too soon to talk about user data and shading state node, folks. Let's just move it slowly. Here you can see the standard shader node. Now to the left, you have all the nodes that you can use to develop shaders and networks. Come down to this texture section and let's click and drag this image node here. As soon as you let go of your mouse, Arnold prompts you to select a texture on your drive. In the text folder of your project files, you have this grid.png image. So let's select that and click on open. Now that we have our image loaded, let's click on the output port of the image. Hold down your mouse. Now drag this line and let it go on this blue input section of the standard surface shader. Now we have this menu which asks us to define an input that we want this texture to control. So go to main, base, color. Now we have defined this image to be used as our base color. Great. Now let's select our standard shader. Under base section, as you can see, we have no longer see the color because it's being controlled by our image node. Let's set the base weight to 1 to see the texture the way we meant to. Also in the specular section of our standard surface shader, let's set the specular weight to 0 so our shader is not reflective. You notice the grid squares are a bit too big, so we can increase the tiling to make them smaller. I'm going to select the image node and under UV coordinates, increase the scaling to 2. Now it looks much better. So that is what we have. And as you can see, our shaders are working just fine. If we wanted to see the grid texture that we just defined as the base color for the floor plane in the viewport as well, I need to connect the image node output to the Arnold viewport port. And now you notice we can see that texture in the viewport, even though it's very low quality. But if I close the shader network and get back to the material editor, I can change the texture preview size to something like 4K and see a better representation of my texture in the viewport. I can do the same thing for the sphere shader. So instead of this grayish color, we can actually see the actual base color. I can simply connect the standard surface node to the Arnold viewport, and now we have these nice representations of our shaders and textures in the viewport. You can select the Arnold parameter tag that is applied to our camera to control the exposure of the scene, or select the camera itself and change the lens as you wish. Now that we have our light, our camera, and our shader, we can start the final render. So go to the render setting, define your output resolution and where you want to save your render, and finally click the render to picture viewer button and wait for your final render. And now we have kicked off our final render, and depending on your machine, it might take a few seconds or a few minutes. In this lesson, we learned about the general and very simplified workflow when you use Arnold as your render engine inside Cinema 4D. See you in the next one.